The small village of Black Hollow, nestled deep within the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest, was a place where time seemed to stand still. The villagers lived simple lives, untouched by the rapid advancements of the modern world. It was a place where everyone knew everyone and secrets were hard to keep. But all that changed one fateful autumn evening when a mysterious antique clock appeared in the center of the village square. The clock was an ornate piece, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with intricate carvings of twisted vines and grotesque faces adorning its dark wooden frame. Its face was a stark white, with black Roman numerals and hands that moved with a precision that was almost unnatural. But what caught the villagers' attention the most was the small digital display at the bottom of the clock face, which showed a series of numbers counting down. No one knew where the clock had come from or who had placed it in the square. It simply appeared overnight, as if it had always been there. The villagers gathered around it, murmuring in hushed tones, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. The clock's ticking was loud, almost deafening, and it seemed to echo through the entire village. Among the crowd was a young journalist named Eliza Harper. She had returned to Black Hollow after years of living in the city, seeking solace and a break from the fast-paced life she had grown accustomed to. Eliza had always been drawn to the mysterious and the unexplained, and the appearance of the clock piqued her curiosity. As she approached the clock, she noticed something strange. The numbers on the digital display were not random, they were counting down. And as she watched, the numbers changed, decreasing by 1. It was then that she realized the clock was counting down the days, hours, minutes, and seconds until something happened. But what? Eliza's journalistic instincts kicked in and she began to ask around, trying to find out more about the clock. But no one seemed to know anything. The villagers were tight-lipped, their faces pale and drawn, as if they were afraid to speak of it. It was as if the clock had cast a spell over the entire village and no one dared to break it. That evening, Eliza sat in her small cottage on the edge of the village, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent the entire day researching the clock, but had found nothing. It was as if the clock had no history, no origin. It had simply appeared out of thin air. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a loud ticking sound. It was the clock, its ticking growing louder and more insistent. She looked out the window and saw the clock in the distance, its face glowing faintly in the darkness. The numbers on the display were still counting down, and as she watched, they changed again. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about the clock that was deeply unsettling, something that went beyond its mysterious appearance. She couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was somehow connected to her, that it had appeared in the village for a reason. The next morning, Eliza woke to the sound of screams. She rushed out of her cottage and into the village square, where a crowd had gathered around the clock. The numbers on the display had reached 0, and as she pushed her way through the crowd, she saw the body of an old man lying on the ground, his eyes wide open in terror. The villagers were in a panic, their faces filled with fear and confusion. Eliza knelt beside the old man, her heart pounding in her chest. She recognized him as Mr. Thompson, the village's oldest resident. He had been perfectly healthy the day before, but now he was dead, his lifeless body lying in the shadow of the clock. Eliza's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The clock had counted down to 0 and Mr. Thompson had died. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? As she stood there, staring at the clock, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Carved into the base of the clock was a name, Harper. Her family name. Eliza's blood ran cold. The clock was connected to her family, but how? And why? She knew she had to find out more, but as she looked around at the terrified faces of the villagers, she realized that she was running out of time. The clock's ticking grew louder, and the numbers on the display began to count down again. Eliza stood frozen in the village square, her eyes locked on the name carved into the base of the clock, Harper. The ticking grew louder, reverberating in her skull like a drumbeat. The villagers around her were in a state of panic, some weeping, others whispering prayers under their breath. Mr. Thompson's body had been carried away, but the shadow of death lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had to act quickly. The clock was counting down again, and she had no idea who its next victim would be. But first, she needed answers. The name Harper was no coincidence. Her family had lived in Black Hollow for generations, though her parents had moved away before she was born. She had always been told that the village held no significance for her family, but now she wasn't so sure. Eliza hurried back to her cottage, her mind racing. She grabbed her laptop and began digging into her family history. Her parents had never spoken much about their time in Black Hollow, and she had never thought to ask. Now she regretted that. She scoured genealogy websites, old records, and even social media, searching for any connection between her family and the village. Hours passed and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her small living room. Just as she was about to give up, she stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the 1920s. The headline read, "Local clockmaker disappears amidst strange occurrences." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the name of the clockmaker, Ezekiel Harper. Ezekiel Harper, her great-great-grandfather. The article was brief, but it mentioned that Ezekiel had been a renowned clockmaker in Black Hollow, known for his intricate and unusual designs. However, his clocks were said to bring bad luck, and after a series of mysterious deaths in the village, he had vanished without a trace. The article ended with a cryptic note. Some say Ezekiel's final creation was cursed, a clock that could steal the life of anyone who crossed its path. Eliza's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. The clock in the square was Ezekiel's final creation. But why had it reappeared now, after nearly a century? And why was it counting down the lives of the villagers? She needed to speak to someone who knew more about the village's history, someone who might remember the stories about Ezekiel Harper. She grabbed her coat and headed out into the cold evening air, making her way to the home of Margaret Whitaker, the village's oldest resident and unofficial historian. Margaret's cottage was on the outskirts of the village, a quaint little house surrounded by overgrown gardens. Eliza knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a frail woman with sharp, knowing eyes. "Eliza Harper," Margaret said, her voice thin but steady. "I've been expecting you." Eliza blinked in surprise. "You have?" Margaret nodded and gestured for her to come inside. The cottage was cluttered with books, trinkets, and old photographs. The air smelled of herbs and dust. Margaret settled into a rocking chair by the fireplace and motioned for Eliza to sit across from her. "You've come about the clock," Margaret said, her gaze piercing. "And about your family." Eliza leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Yes, I found an article about my great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Harper. It said he disappeared after creating a cursed clock." "Is that the one in the square?" Margaret's expression darkened. "It is." Ezekiel was a brilliant man, but he dabbled in things he shouldn't have. He believed he could control time itself, that he could cheat death. But death cannot be cheated, Eliza. It can only be bargained with. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. Ezekiel made a deal with something dark. In exchange for his skill and fame, he promised it lives. The clock was his way of fulfilling that promise. But when the villagers began to die, he tried to destroy it. He failed, and the clock took him instead. Eliza's mind reeled. "So the clock is alive?" "In a sense," Margaret said. "It's a vessel, a tool for whatever Ezekiel bargained with. And now it's back, and it's hungry." Eliza's stomach churned. "But why now? Why after all these years?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Because you're here, Eliza. The clock is tied to your bloodline. It's been waiting for a Harper to return to the village." Eliza felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. "So it's after me?" "Not just you," Margaret said. "Everyone in the village. But you're the key. The clock won't stop until it has what it wants." "And what does it want?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her face grim. "It wants what it was promised. Lives? And it won't stop until the debt is paid." Eliza's mind raced. She had to find a way to break the curse, to stop the clock before it claimed more lives. But how? She had no idea where to even begin. As if reading her thoughts, Margaret reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. She handed it to Eliza. "This belonged to Ezekiel. It might help you understand what he was trying to do. But be careful, Eliza. The clock is watching, and it doesn't like to be challenged." Eliza took the journal, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she said, though her voice felt hollow. Margaret nodded. "Go now. And remember, time is not on your side." Eliza left the cottage, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The clock's ticking echoed in her ears, louder than ever. She knew she was running out of time, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But who in the village would believe her? And who would be brave enough to stand against the clock? As she walked back to her cottage, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the square. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the darkness. He seemed to be watching the clock, his posture tense. Eliza hesitated, then called out, "Hello?" The man turned, and as he stepped into the light, she recognized him. It was Daniel Carter, the village's blacksmith. He was a quiet man, known for keeping to himself, but there was a strength in his eyes that gave her hope. "Eliza," he said, his voice low. "I think we need to talk." Eliza hesitated for a moment, her grip tightening on Ezekiel's journal. Daniel Carter was not someone she knew well, but there was something in his demeanor, a quiet determination that made her trust him. She nodded and gestured for him to follow her back to her cottage. The walk was silent, the only sound the distant ticking of the clock. When they reached her cottage, Eliza lit a few candles and placed the journal on the table. Daniel stood by the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You've been looking into the clock," he said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eliza replied, sitting down. "It's connected to my family. My great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Harper, made it. And now it's killing people." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I know. I've been watching it. I've seen the numbers count down. And I've seen what happens when they reach zero." Eliza's stomach churned. "You saw Mr. Thompson?" Daniel nodded. "I was there when it happened. The clock, it does something. When the numbers hit zero, there's a sound, a kind of chime." And then he trailed off, his face pale. "It's like the life is sucked out of them." Eliza shuddered. She opened Ezekiel's journal, her hands trembling. "Margaret Whitaker gave me this. It belonged to Ezekiel. I think it might have answers." Daniel stepped closer, peering over her shoulder as she flipped through the pages. The journal was filled with sketches of clocks, intricate designs, and notes written in a cramped, hurried hand. Some of the pages were stained with what looked like dried ink or blood. Eliza's eyes scanned the entries, searching for anything that might explain the curse. One passage caught her attention. "The clock is more than a machine. It is a gateway, a bridge between this world and the next. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. The price is too high. The lives it demands, they are not enough. It wants more. It wants everything." She turned the page, her heart pounding. Another entry read, "I have tried to destroy it, but it cannot be destroyed. It is bound to me, to my blood. The only way to stop it is to break the bond. But how? The ritual requires a sacrifice, a life for a life. But whose life? Mine or another's?" Eliza looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide. "There's a way to stop it, a ritual, but it requires a sacrifice." Daniel's expression darkened. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted, "but it has to be someone connected to the clock. Someone from my family." Daniel frowned. "So you?" Eliza's chest tightened. "Maybe. Or maybe there's another way. Ezekiel tried to destroy the clock, but he couldn't. Maybe we can find another solution." Daniel shook his head. "We don't have time for maybes. The clock is counting down. Someone else is going to die soon." As if on cue, the ticking of the clock grew louder, echoing through the cottage. Eliza's heart raced. She flipped through the journal again, searching for more clues. Near the end, she found a sketch of the clock with strange symbols carved into its base. Beneath the sketch was a note. "The symbols are the key. They bind the clock to this world. If they are broken, the bond will be severed." But the cost, the rest of the note was illegible, the ink smudged and faded. Eliza cursed under her breath. "We need to get a closer look at the clock. At those symbols." Daniel nodded. "I'll come with you." They left the cottage and made their way to the village square. The clock loomed in the darkness, its face glowing faintly. The numbers on the display were still counting down, the seconds ticking away relentlessly. Eliza approached the clock, her heart pounding. She knelt down and examined the base, running her fingers over the carvings. The symbols were intricate, almost hypnotic. She pulled out her phone and took a few pictures, hoping she could decipher them later. As she stood up, she noticed something strange. The ticking had stopped. The square was eerily silent. "Eliza," Daniel said, his voice tense. "Look." She turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the square. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes, like something out of a history book. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "Who is that?" The figure stepped forward, and as he moved into the light, Eliza saw his face. It was Ezekiel Harper, her great-great-grandfather. "Eliza," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "You must stop the clock. It's the only way." Eliza's mind raced. "How? How do I stop it?" Ezekiel's form flickered like a candle in the wind. "The symbols, they must be broken. But the cost is too high." "What cost?" Eliza demanded. "Tell me." But before Ezekiel could answer, the ticking started again, louder and more insistent than ever. The numbers on the display began to flash, counting down faster and faster. Ezekiel's form dissolved into the darkness and the square was filled with the sound of the clock's chime. Eliza turned to Daniel, her heart pounding. "We're out of time. We have to break the symbols. Now." Daniel nodded, his face grim. "What do we need to do?" Eliza hesitated. She didn't know. The journal hadn't given her all the answers. But she couldn't wait any longer. The clock was counting down and someone was going to die. She grabbed a rock from the ground and slammed it against the base of the clock, aiming for one of the symbols. The sound of metal against stone echoed through the square, but the symbol remained intact. "It's not working," she cried. Daniel grabbed the rock from her and struck the clock again, harder this time. Still, the symbol didn't break. The ticking grew louder, the numbers on the display flashing faster and faster. Eliza's heart raced. They were running out of time. And then, suddenly, the ticking stopped. The numbers on the display froze. Eliza and Daniel exchanged a glance, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. And then the clock chimed. The clock's chime reverberated through the village square, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Eliza's feet. She and Daniel stood frozen, their eyes locked on the clock as the final note faded into silence. The numbers on the display had reset, beginning a new countdown, but the damage had already been done. Somewhere in the village, someone had died. Eliza's heart pounded as she turned to Daniel. "We need to find out who it was. Maybe we can stop this before it gets worse." Daniel nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll check the east side of the village. You take the west. Meet back here in 10 minutes. They split up, running through the narrow, winding streets of Black Hollow. The village was eerily quiet, as if the residents had sensed the danger and locked themselves away. Eliza's footsteps echoed against the cobblestones as she called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice was met with silence. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a young woman clutching a shawl around her shoulders. It was Sarah, the baker's daughter. "Eliza!" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it? The clock, it chimed again. What's happening?" Eliza grabbed Sarah's shoulders, trying to steady her. "I don't know yet, but I'm trying to stop it. Have you seen anyone? Anyone who might have?" Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, but my father, he's not answering the door. I've been knocking and knocking, but he won't come out." Eliza's stomach dropped. "Take me to him." They ran to the bakery, a small building with a faded sign that read Black Hollow Bakery. The door was locked, but Eliza and Sarah managed to force it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt bread. The ovens were still on, their doors hanging open. "Dad?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. Eliza followed her into the back room where they found Mr. Thompson's body slumped over a table. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unseeing. A half-finished loaf of bread lay in front of him, its dough spilling over the edge of the table. Sarah let out a choked sob, collapsing to her knees. "No, no, no, no." Eliza knelt beside her, her own heart breaking. She had failed. Again. The clock had claimed another victim, and she was no closer to stopping it. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Eliza whispered, placing a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "I'm going to make this right. I promise." Sarah looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "How? How can you stop it? It's evil." Eliza didn't have an answer. She helped Sarah to her feet and led her outside, where Daniel was waiting. His face fell when he saw Sarah's expression. "It was her father," Eliza said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We need to end this. Now." Eliza nodded. The journal mentioned a ritual, a way to break the bond between the clock and my family. But it requires a sacrifice. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of sacrifice?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "But I think it has to be me. The clock is tied to my bloodline. If I can break the bond, maybe it will stop." Daniel shook his head. "There has to be another way. We can't just—" "We don't have time to argue," Eliza interrupted. "The clock is counting down again. If we don't act now, more people will die." Daniel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "What do we need to do?" Eliza pulled out Ezekiel's journal and flipped to the page with the sketch of the clock. "The symbols on the base are the key. If we can destroy them, we can break the bond. But we need to do it during the chiming hour, the moment when the clock resets." Daniel frowned. "The chiming hour?" When is that? Eliza checked the clock's display. In about 6 hours. That's when the countdown reaches 0 again. Then we have 6 hours to figure out how to destroy those symbols, Daniel said. Let's get to work. They returned to Eliza's cottage, where they spent the next few hours poring over Ezekiel's journal. The entries were cryptic and filled with references to rituals and ancient texts. But one passage stood out. The symbols are bound by blood. To break them, the blood must be spilled. But not just any blood. The blood of the one who bears the mark. Eliza frowned. The mark? What mark? Daniel leaned over her shoulder, studying the page. There's a drawing here. It looks like a clock face. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a small birthmark on her wrist. It was faint, but unmistakable. A perfect circle with lines radiating outward, like the face of a clock. I've had this my whole life, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought anything of it. Daniel's expression was grim. It's you, Eliza. You're the key. Eliza's heart raced. So if I spill my blood on the symbols, it might break the bond, Daniel finished. But it's dangerous. You could die. Eliza looked down at the birthmark, her mind racing. She had no choice. If she didn't do this, more people would die. The clock would keep counting down, and the village would be destroyed. I have to try, she said firmly. It's the only way. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Then I'll be there with you, every step of the way. As the hours passed, the ticking of the clock grew louder, more insistent. Eliza and Daniel prepared for the ritual, gathering the tools they would need. A knife, a bowl, and a piece of chalk to draw the necessary symbols. Eliza's hands trembled as she traced the designs from the journal, her mind racing with fear and determination. When the time came, they returned to the village square. The clock loomed in the darkness, its face glowing faintly. The numbers on the display were counting down the final minutes. Eliza knelt in front of the clock, the knife in her hand. She looked up at Daniel, her heart pounding. If this doesn't work, it will, Daniel said firmly. It has to. Eliza took a deep breath and pressed the blade to her wrist. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she didn't flinch. She let her blood drip onto the symbols carved into the base of the clock, each drop sizzling as it made contact. The ticking grew louder, the clock's hands spinning wildly. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, and Eliza felt a strange pull, as if the clock was trying to draw her in. Eliza, Daniel shouted, grabbing her arm. Don't let it take you. Eliza clenched her teeth, fighting against the pull. She poured more of her blood onto the symbols, her vision blurring as the world around her seemed to shift and warp. And then, with a deafening crack, the clock stopped. The ticking ceased. The hands froze. The numbers on the display blinked once, twice, and then went dark. Eliza collapsed to the ground, her strength gone. Daniel caught her, his arms wrapping around her as the square fell into silence. It's over, he whispered. You did it. But as Eliza looked up at the clock, she noticed something strange. The symbols on the base were still there, faint but visible. And the clock's face, it was beginning to glow again. The air on the other side was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic tang that made Eliza's stomach churn. The twisted version of Black Hollow stretched out before her, the buildings warped and decaying, the sky a deep, unnatural red. The clock loomed in the center of the square, its ticking echoing through the eerie silence. Ezekiel Harper stood beside the clock, his hollow eyes fixed on Eliza. His form flickered as if he were both there and not, a ghost tethered to this dark realm. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rasping whisper that sent shivers down her spine. You've come at last, he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. I knew you would. The bloodline always finds its way back. Eliza took a step forward, her heart pounding. What is this place? What have you done? Ezekiel's smile widened. This is the other side, Eliza. The realm beyond the gateway. The clock is the bridge, and I am its keeper. But you already knew that, didn't you? Daniel stepped up beside Eliza, his hand gripping the knife they had brought. We're here to stop you. To destroy the clock and end this curse. Ezekiel laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the empty square. You think you can stop me? You think you can destroy what I have built? The clock is eternal, bound to the bloodline. It cannot be destroyed. Eliza clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. You made a deal with something dark. You traded lives for power. But it ends here. I won't let you hurt anyone else. Ezekiel's expression darkened. You don't understand, child. The clock is not just a curse, it is a balance. A way to keep the darkness at bay. Without it, this world would be consumed. Eliza hesitated, her mind racing. What are you talking about? Ezekiel gestured to the clock. The clock feeds on lives, yes. But it also keeps the darkness contained. If you destroy it, the gateway will open and the darkness will spill into your world. Is that what you want? Eliza glanced at Daniel, her heart sinking. Is he telling the truth? Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't know. But we can't let the clock keep killing people. There has to be another way. Ezekiel's form flickered again, his voice growing more urgent. There is no other way. The clock must remain. It's the only thing holding back the darkness. Eliza shook her head. No. There has to be another way. I won't accept this. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. Then you will doom us all. Before Eliza could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The clock's ticking grew louder, more frantic, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. The red sky darkened and shadows began to creep toward them, twisting and writhing like living things. Eliza! Daniel shouted, grabbing her arm. We need to go. But Eliza stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the clock. No. This ends now. She stepped forward, her mind racing. The journal had mentioned a way to close the gateway to destroy the source. But what was the source? The clock itself? Or something else? As the shadows closed in, Eliza noticed something strange. The clock's face was no longer glowing. Instead, the light seemed to be coming from within, as if something was trapped inside. The source is in the clock, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to break it open. Daniel nodded, though his face was pale. How? Eliza looked down at the knife in her hand. We need to shatter it. Completely. Ezekiel's form flickered violently, his voice rising to a scream. No. You don't understand what you're doing. But Eliza ignored him. She ran toward the clock, the shadows closing in around her. Daniel followed, his knife raised. Together, they began to strike the clock, their blades clashing against the metal. The clock's ticking grew louder, more frantic, and the ground beneath them shook violently. The shadows reached for them, their cold tendrils brushing against Eliza's skin. She gritted her teeth and struck the clock again, her hands trembling. It's not working. Daniel shouted. Eliza's mind raced. The journal had mentioned a sacrifice, a life for a life. She looked down at her wrist, where the birthmark in the shape of a clock face still glowed faintly. It has to be me, she said, her voice steady. I'm the key. Daniel's eyes widened. Eliza, no, but she didn't let him finish. She pressed the blade to her wrist and cut deep, her blood spilling onto the clock. The shadows recoiled and the clock's ticking grew louder, more frantic. Ezekiel's form flickered and faded, his voice a distant whisper. You don't know what you've done. The clock's face cracked, the light within growing brighter and brighter. Eliza fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the world around her seemed to dissolve. Eliza! Daniel's voice was distant, fading into the void. And then, with a deafening crack, the clock shattered. Eliza woke to the sound of birds chirping. She was lying in the village square, the sun shining brightly overhead. The clock was gone, its remnants scattered across the ground. Daniel knelt beside her, his face pale but relieved. You did it, he said, his voice trembling. The clock's gone. The curse is broken. Eliza sat up slowly, her wrist bandaged and sore. The village square was quiet, the air filled with a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. The villagers began to emerge from their homes, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. But as Eliza looked around, she noticed something strange. The birthmark on her wrist was gone. She smiled faintly, her heart heavy but hopeful. The curse was broken, but the cost had been great. She had sacrificed a part of herself to save the village, and she knew she would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of her life. But for now, the ticking had stopped. And that was enough.